Hello, friends. Welcome to another installment in King Arthur Day. Now, as you may have seen throughout the day so far, there is several discussions around Arthur's historicity, about whether he was a historical figure, and if so, how he connects to various figures within the Dark Ages. And there are several suggestions which will have been discussed so far. There are also a number of stories around King Arthur, a literary tradition which spans over 1,000 years and develops in various ways. And we will have touched on some of these at this point. But perhaps one aspect of King Arthur you may not have fully appreciated is that the stories around King Arthur had an important political role within medieval politics. So much so that they could determine the fate of nations, and they were a matter for kings and princes to fight over. And so in this stream, we're going to be exploring the political significance of King Arthur for medieval Britain. And note the word Britain there, we'll be coming back to that a lot of times throughout this stream. And joining me to discuss this fabulous topic, I am overjoyed to be joined by Elizabeth. Hello, Elizabeth. How are you
Hello,
doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here.
It's an absolute privilege. I've been meaning to get you on the channel for a while now, and so I'm so glad that we're able to do this for King Arthur Day. You yourself have quite an interesting King Arthur and history, and so I was wondering, just by way of introducing yourself, could you maybe say a little bit about how you kind of found yourself to this topic?
Well, I'm very much interested in Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote the History of the Kings of Britain, which is one of the first books really that delves into King Arthur as an ancestral tradition that's been passed down among the Britons. The reason that I'm interested in Monmouth and the tales of Arthur is they reflect a greater British antiquity of storytelling, which today after the 1800s, really, we've sort of forgotten. The founding stories of Britain, from Brutus of Troy down to the stories of King Arthur, and the lessons to be learnt from them.
Excellent, and I think you're exactly right, and that was part of the motivation for Arthur Day. Actually, was there is this heritage that we have that was developed, but first by people like Geoffrey of Monmouth, then goes on through various cycles and iterations, and into the Victorian era as well, as will be
Mm-hmm.
touched on. Um, but in our kind of modern deracinated state, where we're almost cut off from our roots, we've lost a sense of what these stories can bring to us, and so discussing them and celebrating them and exploring them is very much what's drawn me to it as well. Maybe that's a good starting place with Geoffrey of Monmouth, because um, really, if we're going to discuss Arthur in British politics, he is the beginning point for much of the discussion. We were talking about before the show about how Geoffrey is really integral to understanding the history, or the story of Arthur as we've received it. There are some earlier sources to do with a potentially historical Arthur, but maybe you might could you comment on kind of how they relate perhaps to Geoffrey?
Yeah, so the earlier sources of King Arthur, which predate Geoffrey, really come from two people. Nennius, a writer. I think he was writing in the 9th century. Is that correct? Yeah,
That's when most scholars date into, yeah.
yeah, and Gildas, who was writing in the 6th century. So
Yes.
he's even earlier. Um, but Monmouth is really the first writer to bring to life and to bring in detail the events and the stories of Arthur. For example, Nennius really only speaks about Arthur's key victories, and there's debate whenever um, Arthur was a king, or whenever he was a warrior. And of course, Gildas doesn't mention Arthur at all. He only mentions his deeds. He doesn't mention him by name.
hmm and he mentions Ambrosius Aurelianus,
Yeah.
but not Arthur himself. Whereas Geoffrey, on top of kind of expanding upon Gildas and Nennius's 12 battles, gives so much more information about Arthur and tells a whole story about his rise to power, his reign, and then his fall. And these become the building blocks for all the later stories about Arthur. There may be changes and variations, but they all have a root in Geoffrey's History of the Kings of Britain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the most interesting aspect really of Monmouth's Arthur is he's really created to be this moral exemplar for great kingship. You know, this figure that sort of arises from the ashes of Vortigern and restores Britain to not only its former glory, but something greater than that, a great European empire. And he goes and marches down to Rome to challenge the authority of Rome. So is Monmouth really trying to represent this sort of virtue of kingship and what kings should aspire to be like? But obviously, the tragedy of Arthur is that he's betrayed in the end, not only by his men but his wife also. And it sort of reflects that after Arthur, there's no great hero among the Britons that rises again. It's just utter decline.
Yeah, so it sees Arthur in a very positive light, and as you're saying, it's this imperial figure who, but his empire building is bound up with his moral qualities, so his courage, his piety, his virtues, his honor. I would say his bravery. He is like good to his men as well. So he doesn't just like keep the land for himself. He parcels it out to various knights as they conquer Europe. They get a bit of land each, right? And this Geoffrey uses this in quite clever ways, because then it's like, oh, this knight, he was the one who got this part of France, and that's where the name comes from for these people who live in France now, and so on. He does that quite often. But I guess that also relates then to the very beginning of the story, because it is, the history isn't just about Arthur; it's about the history of the kings of Britain. So from its very inception, and so here we get the story of Brutus of Troy, drawing on Nennius for this. That Brutus was descended from the exiles after the siege of Troy, where the Trojans were destroyed by the Greeks. And he eventually arrives in Britain with his warband, with the exiles, and they are confronted by a race of giants who live in Britain. And this could, we could interpret this in various ways, but most definitely their kind of chaotic nature, the power and strength of nature, an older world, a mythic world perhaps. And Brutus and his men slay the giants, and then Brutus is the king of all of Britain. You could say by conquering it, he has gained the right to rule it in a way, a kind of might makes right sort of story. But he is also virtuous, and in time his sons inherit it, and he divides it up into three kingdoms, right? So his eldest son gains England, his second eldest gains Scotland, and his third eldest gets Ireland. Wales doesn't count, right? So at this point, they don't think in these terms. So the sorry, his third son gets Wales, not Ireland. My mistake.
Yeah.
And we'll get into the kind of implications of how this works out. But Arthur is like Brutus come back. He reconquers all of these lands which have become divided, both within England and outside of it. And he also slays a giant. This is my favorite bit in Geoffrey, actually, that Arthur goes up to St. Michael's Mount and kills a giant there. And so you can see, like, symbolically, he's playing the same role as Brutus did. He's cleansing the land once more from these beings. So there is a strong emphasis upon, as you say, like, good kingship leads to a unified Britain, a harmonious kingdom, and this is what contemporaries should be doing.
Yeah, Precisely. Again, Brutus. It's quite sad, really, how Brutus of Troy has been forgotten in British
Mm.
history. Not a lot of people speak about these origin myths of Britain, which predate Geoffrey, and they even predate Nennius. For example, there was origin myths. For example, in tribes in France that had the same origin myths of, we descend from the descendants of Troy, and so on. And there's some debate there that a lot of these tribes may have been referring to Troy to sort of put them on equal standing to the Romans, because of course Rome also comes out of the ashes of Troy too. But what's great about Monomyth is he sort of fills in the details that's been recorded for these events. So Nennius talks about Brutus, and he speaks that he comes to Britain, and he's this great king, but he doesn't talk much in detail compared to Geoffrey about Brutus's journey across Europe and how he recruits other people from Troy who have become slaves to the Greeks, and his heroic virtue and how he's this just king. And there's one detail about which Monomyth includes in its work, which I find really interesting, is this dream that Brutus has about the goddess Diana, who appears to him and says, "You will find Britain, and your children will go on to conquer half of the world." Wait, have I lost connection?
No, you're still here. You're still here.
Oh no.
Right.
And when you hear this prophecy of Diana, you automatically think of the British Empire. But what Geoffrey is actually referring to is the Anglo-Normans and their territories in France. And he's sort of, as well, primarily he's foreshadowing the reign of King Arthur. And the great thing about his work is everything seems to be leading up to that point. And oftentimes, like the giants with Brutus and the giants which Arthur defeats, when you read the history of kings of Britain, you have this impression that you've read these events before throughout the book. For example, the sins of kings often vice is a big theme within the book, and it's constantly repeated within the history of the kings of Britain, because it's reflecting the wheel of fortune and the fact that civilizations they come out of the ashes of other civilizations. They reach great points of fortune, and then they decline from vice and sin, which is something Gildas talks about as well within his work.
Well, just as you've mentioned the Wheel of Fortune, I think this might be a good point just to discuss it a little bit more, and explain it for folks. So this concept has its roots in kind of classical mythology and religion. The goddess Fortuna would often be depicted standing next to a wheel and spinning it, and this would be, in a way, the wheel of time. And this then gets developed into the medieval era and changes somewhat. You lose Fortuna, and it becomes maybe time or Christ in this example. Christ sitting at the center of the wheel here, just like perhaps a pagan god at the center of the zodiac, the source of reality and the source of time. And you see here 4 individuals around it. You have the king on top, then a king falling, then you have a king at the bottom. He's lost his kingship, you might say. He's been crushed, and then moving back, climbing back up. And this is supposed to reflect the reality of the fortunes of individuals, but also of men like monarchs. So there's this sense in which, okay, you might be ruling for a time, but eventually you will fall. And whether it's you or somebody else, there'll then be a rising up again. So there isn't a sense of everything's always getting better. There's not infinite progress, as the kind of modern liberal mindset is focusing on, that the march of history always moves in one direction. But at the same time, it's not complete despair. It's not that things are always getting worse, or once you fall that that's you done for. Actually, there's another turn of the wheel, and your fortunes will rise again. So it's a cyclical model of the fortunes of men and women. So then, and as you were saying, this was a key idea in the medieval era, and I have a quotation. Let me see if I can find it here. I think, one second. This is actually from Elizabeth's dissertation on Geoffrey of Monmouth. She has many great quotations in there. So a little shout out for that, and I hope one day it does see publication. So we have here. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the right quotation, because you've got a couple here for the Wheel of Fortune. So this comes from Walter Map, who was writing within this period, and he says the following: "Selden similar to self, now on top, now on the bottom, now on this side, now on that. Ixion is there, turning on his wheel. Nor are there lacking Ixions here who are revolved on the turning wheel of fortune. They rise to glory, they rush down to gloom, and although cast down, they still hope. Nor will there ever be a single day which doth not witness the turn of the wheel. And although on this wheel fear must assail them on all sides, yet is there it on hap without hope. Totally terrifying is its dread. It conquered utterly all qualms of conscience, nor is it alluring of less ever." So what you argue is that this is central to Geoffrey of Monmouth's story, right?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, a lot of the criticisms you see of Monmouth in the modern day, and it's really after the Enlightenment that people completely throw him out of the window, say this guy has made up his history, he's a complete fraud. That's completely not true. And as we reflected on before with the stories of Brutus from Nennius, he is actually reflecting on a more ancient tradition of British of a British understanding of the past. But what's fascinating about the Wheel of Fortune is the history of kings of Britain, like his other contemporaries with their works, such as Henry of Huntingdon and William of Malmesbury. He uses his work as a moral exemplar to sort of to give the Anglo-Normans a book full of lessons of the past, so they won't repeat the same mistakes in their day. And this is important because during the time Geoffrey is writing, he's writing during the anarchy between Matilda and Stephen, a period where it seems likely that things are about to collapse. King David's, it looks like King David's about to invade from Scotland. You have is it Clanwyn? Clanwyn in Wales, I think. Is that Owen Gwendour? But
Owen
the
Gwendour,
earlier, not the 15th century Owen Gwendour. You have him becoming successful within Wales, to the point where it looks like Wales is about to successfully throw the Normans out, and this is something that Monmouth himself touches upon within his work. When he talks about the prophecies of Merlin, he says the Britons will rise again, and they'll throw out the foreigners, and the red dragon will eventually defeat the white dragon, which is comes from a prophecy young Merlin tells. Yeah. But what he's actually referring to with Gwendour is this second coming of Arthur, in the sense of he's this great leader that will unite the Britons, which is quite sad in the sense of if you understand the later history to Wales after Monmouth, it's Clenwen the Great that rises and then is betrayed by his own men, sort of how Arthur's betrayed. But that's going off topic. My point really is that throughout Monmouth's work, all his stories are a moral exemplar. He draws on Gildas, for example, quite a bit, teaching that what led to the ruin of the Britons was infighting and civil war, and was their own sin. It's the fact that they could not unite together, and they kept betraying one another, which led them to be successfully conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. And the Wheel of Fortune, therefore, it plays an integral part in Monmouth's work. You see it throughout. Brutus rises from the ashes of Troy, builds this great civilization, and then through the sin of later kings, they're successfully conquered by the Romans. I mean, even in the history we know to be true, when Caesar came to Britain, the Britons successfully led battles against the Romans, to the point where you have this great Roman general that has to flee from Britain because he just couldn't win, and what leads to the downfall of the Britons in the Roman period with Caesar is that once again they're betrayed by other tribes, that they cannot successfully unite together. So during the Roman period, you sort of see this decline of Britannic civilization, and then you see its rise again with during the Roman period, and then you see its decline once more with Vortigern, where he invites the Anglo-Saxons over because he's so in love with one of their daughters and one of the leader's daughters, and that he's willing to betray his people for his own desires, sort of like the elite throughout history. And in the end, his sons rise up against him, and then you have Ambrose, which comes about, and then after him you have King Arthur, which is this peak again of British civilization. So you see the Wheel of Fortune constantly. But one thing I would say with Monmouth, and you could bring Gildas into this too, is the Wheel of Fortune isn't something that happens by coincidence. It's something that's brought about by the people themselves. Is the wheel spins down when the people sin, when the people betray one another and engage in fights, and that wheel seems to go up when they're virtuous and they're led by great men. So that's a key theme. And of course, what Monmouth is reflecting too is he's saying to the Anglo-Normans, if you repeat the same mistakes of the Britons, then your reign of England is going to come to an end. It's the Wheel of Fortune is going to decline, and you'll lose your grip of power. So remember the lessons of the Britons.
I think that's excellently put, and I think it's a great point that the turning of the wheel is not an impersonal fate, or it does have a providential character, but you're right that it corresponds to the virtues and vices of primarily the rulers, but also the people at any one time. And it's almost like a symbiotic relationship. In a way, it's unclear which one comes first. And perhaps that's modern thinking to try and put it in a causal relationship. It's more just this is how history happens, that you have these virtuous kings who are able to establish a great nation, but then through the vices of the people, the sins of the people, this leads to a breaking up of the order. And in many ways, the conquest of those people by the Romans or the Saxons, the Normans, is a punishment from God for those sins. Gildas's writings are definitely framed in that way. It's a sermon essentially that he's giving his historical account about, and in the history of the kings of Britain, it follows a very similar pattern, that God is actually punishing the Britons for their sins by allowing them to be invaded by the Saxons. And I have a quotation here from the text where Geoffrey writes the following: "Woe to us sinners for the terrible crimes with which we never ceased to offend God when we had time to repent. When the one true judge saw that we would never renounce our sins and that no one could drive our people from its kingdom, he sent him wrath to punish our foolishness. We have been driven out not by your bravery, but by the power of the highest king, against which we ceased to offend." So there is a very strong idea there that the fate of a people isn't primarily determined by its military strength, although that's part of it. It's not determined even by the actions of foreign groups or invaders. It's only allowed to happen because God has decided your time has come. You forfeited the gift I gave you of this land, and so therefore you don't deserve to have it anymore. And as you were saying, this isn't just Geoffrey talking about the Britons, um, uh, talking about ancient history. It's relevant in the time period itself, and perhaps shortly we'll get into the politics in a more detailed way. But it's a message which applies to every era, in essence, for Geoffrey,
Mhm.
because of the wheel is ever present, rather than just the follies of a long lost people.
I mean, yeah, precisely. I mean, Gildas, this Gildian way of thinking of um of history as sort of God punishing the Britons. It was a common theme as well in Henry of Huntington's writings and William of Malmesbury as well, which were direct contemporaries, writing really alongside Geoffrey in the same period. Um, and if you ever read Henry of Huntington's work, I think it's the history of the English people. I think it's called. Um, he yeah, history of the English people. He says in this prologue, I'm basically writing this as a moral exemplar. I'm writing it so lessons can be drawn from this work. And William of Malmesbury to in one of his letters to Queen Matilda says, I have put together this work so you may draw on the lessons of your ancestors. So this key theme of viewing history as this great moral exemplar to draw lessons from is a key theme really within the 12th century. A lot of people don't take note of.
I think I would add as well that because I think it's kind of hard for a modern audience to get our heads around the idea that the morality, not just of the people at large, but perhaps of the king in particular, is really important for the success of a nation, and that this has catastrophic effects. It's not just incidental or accidental.
Mhm.
It's necessarily works out this way in a medieval mindset. And I think perhaps there's two ways I would try to explain it. One is there's an Irish story about a king who he is usurped and his son tries to take his place. And when he does so, the walls that defend the castle keep falling down. They won't stand up. But when the rightful king is returned, the walls stand up once more. A little bit like Vortigern and his tower, which we'll
Oh
get
yeah.
to in a little bit. But the um the the idea here is that the king is like the axis mundi, the pillar of the world that runs through the world turning. And if it's out of kilter, then everything else is out of kilter. The connection between God and the world is lost, and as such, everything fragments. And perhaps building upon this idea is the second kind of illusion in the ancient world. Figures like Aristotle understood the good and the beautiful as consisting in proportionality, in things having a proper relationship to one another. This included things like architecture. So, what makes a beautiful building for Aristotelian of influenced people like Vitruvius? It is the proper ordering of parts to the whole. So, symmetry might be a good description of this. This also applies, though, to all of life. So it would be things like health. So having a moderate, proportional diet, and the properties of the blood being in a proper proportional relationship to one another. It would include morality, so proportionality in the neither following an extreme nor a deficit in your actions, but the middle way. This also includes the relationship of a society in proportionality. And so, if you think about it like that, if one thing is not in proportion with the rest, if it is deficient or excessive in one regard, then the whole thing is tainted by this. The whole edifice begins to collapse. The structure can't
Mhm.
stand up anymore. It requires everything to be in proportion. So if one element is out of proportion, the whole thing breaks. And so if like the king is out of proportion, if he is like Vortigern pursuing foreign policy based on lust, then this is going to lead to the collapse of his kingdom. So
Yeah,
this is the kind of way that ancient and medieval peoples thought about the world. That it's like a building structure that you pull a plank out of, and it all falls down. So that's so when we're talking about these things in the Wheel of Fortune and the necessary consequences that follow from vice, that's the kind of model we need to be thinking about. And I mean, we're on the surface. There's probably a lot of truth in it.
yeah. I mean, exactly. And the story of Vortigern again really hammers that point through that it's not the Britons, themselves, the people which have led, the Anglo-Saxons to invade their homeland. It's Vortigern because of its lust and its personal desires. I think I read somewhere that the Britons, they went to Vortigern and they pleaded to him and they said, kick out the Anglo-Saxons, please. They're pagans. They can't integrate into society, and we're having a lot of trouble living with them. And Vortigern and just ignores them, ignores them, and that leads to ruin. But one key theme about the story of Vortigern is it shows when the people aren't listened to and their demands aren't met, is they sort of overthrow these people who have betrayed them. And you can see that with Vortigern's sons who eventually overthrow their father.
Mm,
One thing I will point is, and this is a quote which is towards the end of Joffrey's work, where he basically just hammers the point of, well, the sins and the mistakes which the Britons made, which directly led to their ruin. And he writes, to the Britons, he says, "Why, you slothful race, weighed down by your terrible sins? Why, with your continued thirst for civil war, have you weakened yourself so much by internal strife? You once subjected far-off realms to your power, but are unable to protect your land, wives, and children from your foes, so that you assemble a fine yard, once good but now turned bad. Go on, wage your civil war, unmindful that in the gospel it says, every kingdom divided against itself shall be laid waste, and house fall on house. Your kingdom is divided against itself. Lust for civil war and a cloud of envy has blunted your mind. Your pride has prevented you from obeying a single king, and so your country has been laid waste before your eyes by most wicked barbarians, and its house fall once upon another. Your descendants will regret it one day, when they see the subs of barbarian lioness take their towns, cities, and other possessions, while they themselves will become miserable exiles who will scarcely, if ever, reign their past glory. Um,
mm,
so he's really saying what's led to your ruin, therefore, is internal strife. And this quote is great because he's not just referring to the Britons directly with this. He's actually, again, he's saying this to the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. He's saying, by having this civil war, between Matilda and Stefan, you don't realize the dangers you have put yourself into, and the fact that now Wales and Scotland is looking to invade and overthrow the Anglo-Norman power. Um, So
Yeah.
and that's sort of the purpose of Joffrey's work. And to link it back to Arthur, you start to understand that Arthur, therefore, in Joffrey's work, is again this great leader who is brought to ruin directly by civil strife and internal conflict. He
But
conquers Europe. It's the troubles at home which ultimately defeat him.
yeah, and just to explain that for those who don't know, it's while he's away, you could say on crusade in a sense, but while he is conquering Europe and against the Roman Empire, his nephew Mordred, who is the regent at that point, kidnaps Guinevere, the queen. Although it's not totally clear whether she's willing or not in the Historia. A little bit of Helen of Troy, perhaps, creeping in there. But let's say he kidnaps her and then takes the kingdom for himself. And Arthur is then forced to return to Britain and face Mordred. And they have a climactic battle at the Battle of Camlan or Camelin. This itself is referenced in a lot of earlier sources, including the Annals of Wales or Cambrai. So it's quite a Geoffrey's drawing on something quite ancient there. Mordred is killed. Arthur is mortally wounded and is thus taken to the Isle of Avalon. And Geoffrey leaves it at that mysteriously. We don't hear what happens after that to Arthur, but we may. Well, we're going to touch on some prophecies perhaps in a little bit. But what's striking about that then is, again, you were talking about Vortigern. His sons overthrow him. With Arthur, his nephew overthrows him. And well, what's striking on the one hand, the relationship between a king and his nephew in Saxon literature is supposed to be very intimate. In some ways, it's almost more intimate than that between a father and son. And you see this in a poem like Beowulf. It's Wiglaf, his nephew, who comes to his rescue against the dragon. And this gets taken up in the Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, right, with Theoden and his nephew and niece. It's Eomer and Eowyn. So that he's definitely building on that. But here we've got a total inversion of that relationship with Mordred, who betrays his uncle's trust spectacularly. And this then goes back to this, what we were just saying about the proportionality and right order, that in a way, what happens when one thing's out of kilter is the whole order, the natural order, which allows humans to flourish, is totally subverted and chaos and evil reign once more. So getting that order right and having the right people in place is critical. But because of the nature of, most people, it's almost impossible for it to last forever. And so kind of maybe turning to the actual political situation that Joffrey was writing in. We actually haven't said the date that he wrote this, and the dating. I know there's a little bit of kind of, we can't know for sure, but it seems around 1138, perhaps 1136 to 1138 seems to be when he was writing the history. He had written other Arthurian texts before that point, such as the prophecies of Merlin. And this comes at a time, as you've alluded to, just on the cusp of the anarchy, or during the anarchy, which was a situation which began really in 1120 with the White Ship disaster. So just a little bit of background context. William the Conqueror conquers England in 1066. The Normans become the aristocracy and are governing much of England during this period. And eventually, William's descendant Henry I, becomes king. And in 1120, his son William and several of the Norman aristocracy set sail. Were on this ship. Now, this ship sunk and they were drowned. And so Henry lost his only surviving legitimate heir. So when Henry himself died, a little bit later, let me find the exact date of that. So he died in 1135. So 3 years before the Joffrey's work was completed. This leads to a huge kind of succession crisis. And on the one hand, you have the Empress Matilda. On the other hand, you have Stephen or King Stephen. And this leads to civil war within England and a breakdown of kind of royal governance. You see barons kind of essentially, those who don't get involved become their own sort of magnates and warlords. Thievery seems to flourish. Justice seems to decline. There's a lot of pillaging and tyranny. So this is a really bad period within within England that's just kind of started when Geoffrey writes this. And as you were saying, Elizabeth, the Welsh and the Scots are taking advantage of this too at this point. So you've got in Wales, you have rebellions against Norman rule. Oh, we've lost Elizabeth. Hopefully she comes back in a moment. You have rebellions against Norman rule with Owain. And in the north, David I, he captures larger parts of northern England in 1136 and 1138. He attacks Lancashire in the north of England. He also takes Berwick-upon-Tweed, which at this time is one of the most important economic centres within England, probably second only to London, or close to it because of its because it's on the sea, it has good connections to Scandinavia and the Low Countries. So David the First is taking advantage of this. So there's a real threat from Wales and Scotland at this point, whilst there's a succession crisis going on within England. Let me welcome back Elizabeth here.
I keep cutting out.
It's okay. It's okay. I was just really kind of going into the political situation that there really was anarchy going on politically, and I guess then for Joffrey, what he's writing really is hitting home on the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, that if they don't resolve this succession crisis quickly, if they allow the civil war to continue, that there's a real chance that they themselves, having been there only 60, 70 years, are going to be thrown out of England.
Yeah. I mean, one brilliant thing about Joffrey's work, particularly in relation to the Prophecies of Merlin, which was supposed to be included in the history of Kings of Britain originally. So he started writing the history of the Kings of Britain originally, but was told to publish the Prophecies of Merlin separately. And that's because you sort of, during the time it was published in, anarchy was really striking Britain within the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. That a man came up to Joffrey and told him to publish it, which shows that people at the time understood what Joffrey was getting at through his Prophecies of Merlin and what he was referring to, and they understood the moral lessons of it and the warnings that could be learnt from his work. But the Prophecies of Merlin really are this example really of how great Monomyth is at writing his history and the sort of rhetorical devices he includes and the storytelling he implements to it. Wait, did I cut out again? Sorry.
No, you're right. You're still here. Yeah.
Okay. Is that the Prophecies of Merlin aren't predicting. They're not predicting the future. They're really this retelling of modern events. So he refers to the line of justice, which is supposed to be Henry I, and he makes reference to Matilda within the prophecies and to Scotland. In one line he says, Normandy will lose both islands and be stripped of its former glory, then the natives will return to the island, for strife will rise among the foreigners. Claudius will summon Cornelius and make Scotland his ally. Then the foreigners will be slaughtered, the rivers will flow with blood, and the hill of Brittany burst forth and be crowned with Brutus's domain. Wales will be filled with rejoicing, and Cornish oaks will flourish. The island shall be called by Brutus's name, and the foreign town will disappear. And within that, he refers to this person called the Six, who's actually he's actually is referring to Owen Grenard within that as well. So it's this really foreshadowing of events of what will happen if the Anglo-Norman aristocracy keep bickering among one another, as we touched on before.
Well, what's interesting about that too is there is an attempt, in a sense, not with the Welsh directly, but David I of Scotland does come down to fight alongside Robert, Earl of Gloucester, who is the one who Joffrey dedicates the history to, and he does, but that's on behalf of Empress Matilda, who is married to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou. And so there is this sense of the Brittany coming forth with Scotland. It doesn't work, but that's they're trying to tap into this prophecy, I think, in some ways. And I guess more broadly, you alluded to it earlier. There's this idea. Merlin interprets the vision of Vortigern, which he has about why this tower won't stand up that he's got. It's because there's two dragons fighting underneath it, a white and a red dragon. The white dragon several times attacks the red dragon and pushes it back. Seems like it's going to die, but eventually the red dragon triumphs over the white dragon. And this appears in Nennius, but in Joffrey it's more fully fleshed out, and it's interpreted as the white dragon being the Saxons and the red dragon as being the Britons or the Welsh. So this, but this can then carry over, and there's almost a sense in which it could be seen again as the white as being the Anglo-Normans and the Britons being the Welsh. But there is a little twist here, because I think it's also the case that, and I think you argued this, that Joffrey isn't kind of advocating for the Britons winning. He's not really. It's not really propaganda, like Welsh propaganda, and you can. It's more addressing the Anglo-Norman elite and taking it that okay, they're here and they do have a right to rule, but they might lose that right if they keep going down this path. And I think the strongest evidence for this actually is that he locates the Normans as having Arthurian descent, because when Arthur conquers France as part of his imperial kind of expansion against Rome, he gives Normandy to Bedivere, the butler of Arthur. Now, this is quite different from the Saxons, who Hengist and Horsa have no connection to Brutus, and they have no kind of claim to descent from the kings of Britain, whereas the Normans can claim, oh, we do have an Arthurian origin here, so we can claim to be the inheritors of Arthur's empire, not just in Britain but in France as well. So he's not attacking their legitimacy in that regard. He's emphasizing their need to get their act together, to unite and stop fighting amongst themselves, or they will follow the way of the Saxons and so on.
Yeah, because for example, when you see the Anglo-Saxons, you see them rising out of the ashes again of the Britons, and sort of Hengist and Horsa are really the Anglo-Saxon version of Brutus. And in Anglo-Saxon stories, they're supposed to be descended from Odin, but of course that changes in later times. And you see that circle again decline in 1066 when they're replaced by the Normans. And what Joffrey is sort of telling the Normans is, your reign isn't going to rule forever. Things, this mindset of things can only get better, sort of how we view history today is this linear progress. He says it isn't true. It's through your own actions you'll turn out like the Anglos and you'll turn out like the Britons, where you're just replaced by another better group. And what's interesting again about the point of Brittany is a key theme within Joffrey's work actually is, the Britons in Brittany are what's left of this great Britannic race, and it's the Welsh really, which is the part of the race which has morally declined and is sinful and slothful and keeps bickering among themselves. And a lot of people who write about Joffrey normally took that as an example. Oh, well, Joffrey must have been from Brittany then. He keeps glorifying he keeps glorifying Brittany. But in reality, what he's doing is, again, he's saying, well, you've also defended, parts of the Normans are also descended from this great race of Britons. You should try to live up to their greatness as well. For Brutus is equally your ancestor. You shouldn't become like the Welsh, who have become this sinful race that cannot stop infighting.
Well, I think on that note,
I'm sorry if you can hear voices in the background. It's like a Palestinian protest going on outside.
Oh, okay. Well, let us move on then from Joffrey to maybe our kind of second major point within Arthur and medieval politics, and maybe there's a transition point we could I'll just touch on briefly, is that in the latter half of the Anarchy, you have Henry II, or the future Henry II, come to the fore, and when he becomes king on the death of Stephen, he really manages to reunite England, at least for a time, re-establish kind of the king's justice through his courts and justices of the peace. And he has men like William Marshall who aid him in this effort. And the Marshal, if you haven't come across him, I would recommend everybody have a look into his story. He's been variously described as the greatest knight ever.
The knight that saved England.
The knight that saved England many times, many times, both in Henry's reign and in later times as well, and was quite influential in having the Magna Carta enshrined in English law. So, but he read the romances, he read Joffrey, he was very inspired to live up to that kind of Arthurian ideal. And so it took men like that to restore England as best they could. But for many years, although Arthur was an important figure and was somebody that was well known, not just in Britain, but across Europe, and we see evidence in Italy, for example, of sculptures to do with Arthur during this time period. The king that really takes on Arthur in a very special way is Edward I in the 1200s. Yeah. Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, a terror to Celts everywhere. He is the one who takes on the mantle of King Arthur in several ways, and it's going to take a bit of time to work through all of them. And I think maybe the first place we should begin is not necessarily with his imperial ambitions, but actually the life of the court, you might say, of Edward I. And one of the remarkable things that Edward spends his time doing is holding round tables. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, a round table would be a kind of multi-day event for the aristocracy, and it would involve a great feasts, tournament fighting, so men with blunted weapons doing jousts and combat and so on. There would be performances, so they may take on a role each within an Arthurian romance. So I came across one recently where it was the story of Owain and Lancelot, and the different nobles would take on a different part within the story and act it out for the whole for the whole group. But of course, the feast itself would take place with a round table, a giant round table, and several of these seem to have happened during Edward's reign. And there is evidence of an actual round table from this time. This is the Winchester Round Table. The dating on it, it's been tested for when it would have been created from the materials. It seems like it was 1275, so in the heart of Edward's reign. The painting on it comes from later, from the Tudor era, and we'll touch on that. But the actual table itself, it was like I think it's like 18 feet in diameter, or it could be bigger than that, but it's certainly a big table, so big that you wouldn't be able to move it very easily. So it's not something that would have been transported around the country. It's for this place, for the celebrations at Winchester, which may have been initiated by the king, or he may have been invited to it. But the significance of Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, this is an iconic image identifying Edward as King Arthur, or in the mantle of Arthur, with his knights having an equality with his nobles, which is quite important in a period where you've got to keep your nobles on side, and bringing all that kind of chivalric glory to the table, but associating it with the king and his followers.
Yeah. I mean, Edward the First really is this sort of second coming of Arthur in that way. One more point I will just make of Joffrey, and then I'll finish.
Okay, yeah.
Joffrey, and this links back to Edward the First. Is, after 1066, it's really the last time Britain's invaded by foreigners. But the circular system still repeats throughout British history, although, of course, Joffrey never writes about the future, because during this time he's passed away. But Edward I is really a part of this new aristocracy, which takes place after Matilda and Stephen, which is the Plantagenets. That comes about with Henry II. So throughout British history, you'll constantly see the circular system sort of rise and fall, but it will rise and fall with different aristocracies taking its place. As we'll probably touch upon later, the Tudors also reflect, again, this new aristocracy rising out of the ashes of the previous one too, when the Tudors come to reign. But what's great about Edward I, though, is he's this king, which after his death is directly referred to and compared to Arthur. Sometimes writers even said he was greater than Arthur. I mean, Langtoft wrote in 1296, following Edward I's conquest of Scotland, he wrote, "Now the islands are all joined together, and Albany reunited to the kingship, of which Edward I is proclaimed lord. Cornwall and Wales are in his domain, and Great Ireland at his will. There is no king nor any prince in all these countries save King Edward, who has united them thus. Arthur never held these fiefs so fullily." Which I think is great. Being compared not only to King Arthur, but having a right to say you're greater than Arthur is an achievement, I think.
Yeah, and I think he adds to that, Langtoft, that Arthur, although he was able to save the Britons from the Saxons, he never repelled them from the shores of Britain. And eventually, after Arthur's kingdom collapsed and was defeated by its internal forces, and he or another contemporary writer says that never happened to Edward. So there's this very clear, Edward's actually the perfect Arthur. He goes beyond Arthur. He doesn't suffer from the wheel of fortune in his own life. So in a way, they're trying to say Edward breaks the wheel. Everything does get better with Edward, if you're English.
Yeah, it does. Edward really does represent, the wheel going up during his
Mm.
reign. But of course, it's his son Edward II that loses everything. He loses Scotland. He's defeated by Robert the Bruce. Things can only get worse under Edward II, and there's great offence actually between Edward I and Edward II. It's like Edward I knew that when he passed away and when he died, his son was going to ruin everything. There was one incident within his court where he nearly pulled out all of his son's hair in anger, and when he was much older. And of course, on Edward I's deathbed, he asks for, is it his heart to be buried in Scotland? Because he probably knows that he's now going to his all of his achievements are now going to be lost to this son he didn't expect to overtake him, because all his other sons died. And what I find really great though about Edward I is there's this great story of when he's first crowned king after his father passes away, and he takes the crown off his head during his coronation, and he says, I will not wear this crown again until I've restored the lands my father has lost in France. But by the end of his life, he really achieves a mighty achievement. He restores what was lost after King Arthur, which is a unified Britain in that way. And even better, he takes Ireland as well. So he really is this marvelous king. There's a very valid reason why he was compared mightier than Arthur, because he wasn't betrayed like Arthur in the end.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and you can see why contemporaries would see him in this way. And before we get to kind of his imperial successes, I think it's worth just saying as well, along with the Round Tables, Edward is very much styling himself. Like, he's embracing this idea as well. So he's presenting himself in an Arthurian mode. So he holds these Round Table feasts. He also becomes a figure who knights knights from all across Christendom. So you have like men from Spain coming to Edward's court looking to be knighted by this king. They want to be knighted by somebody they consider the most chivalrous king in Europe. And so they go to Edward. And of course, at this time, he is probably the senior statesman or Christian ruler within Christendom. There's the fall away in the kind of authority of the monarchs in France and Spain and in the Holy Roman Empire, and Edward becomes the leading figure, in part because of his activities on the Crusades when he was a younger man, but also because of his achievements. And so he does get this reputation. And so when he goes to other countries, they hold Round Table feasts for him, for example. I think that happens in one of the Spanish kingdoms.
Wow.
And again, another aspect. So like in these knighting ceremonies, they'd often take place at Pentecost. Now, for those of you who know your Arthurian stories, Pentecost is quite important because on one such Pentecost, Arthur receives submissions from all of the kings under his rule. There's a great celebration, and the King of Scotland comes down and offers his tokens of submission to Arthur. You also see in the stories surrounding the Holy Grail, these often take place. The Grail appears to the Knights of the Round Table at the Feast of Pentecost. So Edward's tying in a lot of his celebrations to what happens within the Arthurian story. And perhaps the most significant is beyond just knighting people at these feasts and Pentecost celebrations, they also have various vows and promises and oaths take place. So on one occasion, he knights his son Edward, who then goes on to knight 300 knights. And then the next day they have a vow that they're going to go and avenge John Comyn, who's been slain by Robert the Bruce. And so they all pledge that they're going to rectify this wrong at this Pentecost feast. And it's very like Arthurian in nature. You can just picture the scene in the quest for the Holy Grail. All of them come together. I think it's Gawain that says first, I'm going to go and find the Holy Grail. Then Lancelot says it, and Galahad and the whole troop do it. Edward's doing that in real life. Is it a LARP? I don't know, but it's he's definitely embracing Arthurian kind of behaviors and activities within his court.
Yeah, that's amazing. I had no idea about that detail in relation to Edward the First. That's
Mm.
really interesting. Um, I descend from the MacDougals, a Highland clan, in Scotland, who their clan leader was the brother-in-law of of the man murdered by Robert the Bruce.
Oh, okay.
It's quite interesting to hear that actually, Edward the First was on the MacDougall side. I'm not betraying my Scottish ancestors by glorifying the First. What about the Bruce is the true traitor, really? I
I
mean, after the war with Scotland, he took um, the castles and land away from the MacDougals and handed them to the Campbells, the worst Scottish clan in Scotland. Um, but that's going off. Um, the Campbells also committed the Glencoe massacre, so they're awful. Anyway, but yeah, there's actually. I know I'm going off topic, but I'll just say this anyway. There's a hotel in the Highlands in Glencoe, if you ever go to it, and you have a
Mhm.
big sign up, no Campbells. We don't serve Campbells. That's how hated they are. They're an awful clan. Um, but anyway, back to Edward the First, not the Glencoe massacre. Yeah, a lot of people say when they're discussing Edward the First, in relation to um, his Arthurian interest. For example, he holds a round table in Wales, and he holds in Wales after the victory over Clenwen the Great. And he also holds a round table a year after the Battle of Falkirk with William Wallace. And of course, after some of his key battles in Wales too, he reburies King Arthur as well, along with Guinevere, sort of to symbolise that Arthur's dead and he's not coming back, and he's buried in England now. He's not in Wales whatsoever. He's sort of reclaiming this legend for the English, and a lot of people use that to say, well, Edward I must have only been interested in King Arthur as a way to sort of gain power over the Welsh and the Scottish, but that's not true whatsoever. Of course, this the example you pointed out, but the only known book we know that Edward I ever read was that of the Tales of King Arthur, and his wife as well was very much interested in the legends. Um, so we know that Edward's interest in King Arthur was also far greater than his interest in Wales and Scotland with the Round Tables.
I think that's very fair, and I think there's evidence as well that Edward actually commissioned somebody to write one of the romances. I can't remember which one, but you can find. I think you will be able to find it in the book edited by Arthur Loomis on Arthurian literature. The so he's not somebody who's got a passing interest in it, who's using it cynically. He is somebody who fully buys into the character of Arthur and what the Knights of the Round Table stood for, and wants to cultivate that amongst the nobility of his time period, not just within England, but you could say in Christendom. And he becomes, for many outside of England as well, seen as this figure come back, you might say, and or at least the inheritor of
Yeah.
that tradition. And so maybe this is a good point to then get into what you were just mentioning about Wales and Scotland, with that in mind. And let's turn to Wales first. So in the 1270s, late 1270s, Edward was leading England in war against Llewellyn, who was one of the princes in Wales who had rebelled against kind of English overlordship or direct rule of Wales, and this was taking place. There was several rebellions, right? So there was Llewellyn, who was defeated, and in his defeat had to hand over the crown of Arthur, which is the crown of Wales, right? So Edward takes that, and takes it to the grave of Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey. He offers it to him, and then there's another rebellion in 1277. Sorry, 1278, spring of 1278, which is founded around the idea that Arthur will return and drive out the English. And again, drawing on these prophecies of the white dragon being overthrown by the red dragon. And so in the Easter of 1278, Edward does something pretty amazing. He holds his Easter court at Glastonbury Abbey. Now, Glastonbury Abbey had been associated with King Arthur in a number of different ways. One is through the writings of Robert de Boron in the late 1100s, 1190s or so, around the Holy Grail, which essentially lay out the idea that Joseph of Arimathea, the biblical figure, brought the cup from the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, which had been filled with Christ's blood from the cross, to Britain and established Glastonbury Abbey as a monastery. So we have one connection there, and people often, when they're hunting for the Holy Grail, talk about Glastonbury. But another connection comes through Henry II, who allegedly reported to the monks at Glastonbury that he had heard from a Breton troubadour that Arthur and Guinevere were buried at Glastonbury. And so the monks at that time actually did an exhumation. They did retrieve the body, but Henry had died before that point, so he didn't get to see it. And they then reburied the bodies. And so it's only with Edward in 1278 that this comes about again. And we actually have a written account from Adam of Damerham of what takes place during this ceremony that takes place, this spectacular ceremony. And I'm just going to read from it a little bit here. So they open up the tombs, and in two separate chests, decorated with their portraits and arms, the king's bones of wonderful size, that's King Arthur's bones, and those of Queen Guinevere of great beauty. On the following day, the king again enclosed the king's bones in their chest, wrapped in a precious pall, while the queen did the same for the queen's bones. That's Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. They marked them with their seals and directed the tomb to be placed speedily before the high altar, while the heads and knee joints of both were kept out for the people's devotion. This was the inscription put on the inside. These are the bones of the most noble King Arthur, which were placed here on the 19th of April in the year of the Lord's incarnation, 1278, by the illustrious Lord Edward, King of England. And there's a few things to maybe mention about this. One, I just love the reference to King Arthur's bones being of marvelous size. Like he must have been a great tall and big man, perhaps relating to those old Welsh poems which call him of the giant race. And Queen Guinevere's bones are beautiful. Like who knew what beautiful bones looked like, but somehow they knew what Guinevere's were, right? Another thing is, like, they're almost treated like a saint's relics, because they leave out the head and the knee joints so that they can be seen. And there's a sense in which, in the medieval world, a saint's relics, which could be their bones, it could be an object that they were associated with. With Christ, it's like Christ's cross, or the Holy Grail itself would be a relic. These are things which can convey God's power, healing power, blessing, for good harvest, things like that, and spiritual as well. And so there's a sense in which seeing the bones of Arthur is almost, it has that quality. And that's why these two bits are left out for the people to see. They can be treated as such. But politically, there's a couple of things going on here, isn't there? One is that Edward's very much identifying himself with Arthur and Eleanor with Guinevere. They're
Mhm.
definitely seeing themselves as in continuity with them. But the other thing is that, remember, the Welsh are claiming Arthur is returning. Let's all band together and rise up against Edward, and Arthur will overthrow him. Edward's saying, no, Arthur's dead, and I've just reburied him, and he's not getting out of that. I've put my seal on his tomb. It's not coming. He's not coming back. So this is
Yeah.
like trying
You,
to totally crush Welsh hopes of Arthurian restoration.
yeah. I mean precisely, and I think the author Morris also writes within his work on Edward at first that Edward goes to Glastonbury not to glorify Arthur, but to bury him. But I think it's more than that. I think he's actually saying, I am the second coming of Arthur. Arthur's this great, with the description of the bones, he's sort of this very tall, strong warrior man. Well, Edward I was also referred to as Edward Longshanks because he was so greatly tall that he towered over people, really. But what was quite beautiful about the historical events of this period is the kind of like sort of a repeat of Joffrey's work again. You have Clemwen the Great who gets starved out in Snowdonia, who's this this man who's saying to Edward, "I am the true king of Britain. You should pay homage to me." And in that way, what other figure went to Snowdonia after they were defeated? Vortigern. Vortigern did, with the prophecies of the two dragons, and then after Vortigern, of course, you have this King Arthur figure that emerges, and Edward is that figure, and he sort of refers again, knows this and directly refers to himself as this through the burial of Arthur and Clemwen, which take place after Clemwen the Great's defeat, which is
Hmm.
even longer. Another
I
thing,
would.
sorry,
No, you
I
go
was just
ahead,
going.
Elizabeth.
Another thing as well, which a lot of people forget to point out, is that this isn't the only time where Edward makes a direct reference to the antiquity of the British past within Wales.
Hmm.
He draws a lot on the tales of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and he doesn't just focus on King Arthur. When he builds Carnarvon Castle, he says he finds the body of Magnus Maximus, and he
Hmm.
reburies him as well in a ceremony similar to the burial of Arthur and Guinevere. So he always keeps directly making reference to the British past and its antiquity as well. When we get later in his reign during the Scottish Wars of Independence, he writes a letter to the Pope, really justifying his invasion of Scotland. I've
Well,
got it.
let's hold on to that thought. Hold on to that thought because we'll come to it.
Yeah.
We'll come to
Okay.
it. I'll let you read it then. I'll let you read it then. But I
Okay.
think let's just it might be worth just finishing with Wales before we move to Scotland.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think, and I think there's you're exactly right that he reburies Magnuson Magnus Maximus. That's it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
who's mentioned in Joffrey's history,
Hmm.
and he and is a kind of proto Arthur figure himself in some ways
Yeah.
in Welsh mythology,
Hmm.
um, and he holds a round table in 1284 after the final defeat of the Welsh in Carnarvon. So again, he's reconnecting all of these things together, and saying, this is the culmination of the kind of Arthurian project rather than undermining it. But at the
Hmm.
same time, no, I think you're right that it's not just about disproving Arthur returning, but I do think it is worth laboring the point, and we haven't really said this too strongly yet, that when we say like Welsh people believe that Arthur could return, there is a metaphorical sense in which that's true, in terms of somebody like Edward taking on that mantle. but there is an also, we might say, literal belief in Arthur's return
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is recorded by several figures during this period, several historians like Peter of Blois, Henry Huntingdon, William Malmesbury, I think it is,
yeah.
includes it too.
There's that
The,
story, which predates Joffrey actually. So if anyone tells you, oh, this idea that Arthur is going to return, Joffrey, completely untrue. Actually, there was an event before Joffrey published his writings where in Cornwall, the some Anglo-Norman, some Normans went there, and they said to the Cornish, King Arthur's not going to return. What you're telling me is just utter, is is just buffoonery. And the Cornish decided to fight them in a. I
yeah,
think one of
yeah,
them put it in the face. So it really, this idea which is embedded within Welsh and Britannic tradition.
you also find the same thing in Brittany as well during this time, and of course the
Yeah.
Bretons are ethnically and culturally linked with the Welsh. They are the descendants of those who were driven out by the Saxons, essentially,
Mhm.
from Britain, and they during this period have a very intense kind of devotion to Arthur. One writer reports, an anonymous writer, that if you mention that Arthur was dead to the Bretons, then you will be lucky to escape being crushed by stones. Another writer, I think it. Let me double check. I think it's Henry of Huntingdon. He writes that the Bretons see Arthur like the Jews see their Messiah, that he's going to return or come and restore them to the promised land. So they see,
Mhm.
like, when Arthur comes back, the Bretons will come back to Britain and rule again. And so um, this isn't just like a metaphor or a nice allegory for interpreting current events. For some groups, this is a serious thing that could happen and will happen. So when the Welsh are saying, "Oh yeah, Arthur's going to return and going to overthrow Edward," they're serious about it. And so Edward's Glastonbury ritual is an attempt to both elevate himself as the rightful inheritor of Arthur, and really is Arthur returned or Arthur surpassed, as we were alluding to earlier, but also trying to put to bed this idea that Arthur will come back. It doesn't work, right? The Welsh aren't convinced by this. This is like your enemy's propaganda. Of course, it's not right. Of course, it wasn't really Arthur at Glastonbury. That's what the Welsh were saying, but it didn't matter because militarily Edward was able to defeat them, and so he defeats the Welsh. As we said, he has this celebration at Carnarvon in 1284, and things don't really. There's a kind of quiet spell, and then in the 1290s, Edward becomes interested in Scotland, and you've pointed out in one of your essays that before this point, Edward wasn't interested in kind of invading Scotland or taking it as part of a British project, but it really comes about due to his involvement in the Great Cause, which for those who don't know, it's again another succession crisis. This seems to be the thing which turns the wheels of history in many ways. Alexander III had died and had left behind his very young granddaughter, Margaret, but who herself died, leaving a succession crisis within Scotland. There were many contenders for the throne, including John Balliol, Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce's father, I think, at this point, right? And so there's a great kind of question: who should be the next king? And the Scottish nobles ask Edward to oversee this process. Now, Edward, this is a great opportunity for him, but he accepts the invite. He's also unclear on his constitutional role within this. And so he sends out letters to all the monasteries in England asking for the monks to find out what is the English king's relationship to Scotland. And so the monks get to work, and a few of them reference Brutus of Troy, as
Mhm.
you were going to say, Elizabeth. So this, and I won't say what they say because I think you were going to come to it. But eventually, due to kind of falling out with the nobles at various points, Edward eventually wants to take Scotland as a subjugated kingdom. It's not direct rule, but it is. He would be the overlord or the overking of the King of Scotland. So, in this case, it would be John Balliol, who he's appointed as king, should defer to Edward, right? But eventually, Balliol revolts himself for various reasons, and there becomes a kind of contest between the Scottish nobles and King Edward about who has the legitimate claim to Scotland. And so in 1301, Edward sends a letter to Pope Boniface the Eighth, and he gives his reasons for why he is legitimately the overlord of Scotland. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Elizabeth. What are his arguments here?
I just want to draw quickly on Alexandria the Third before I delve into the letter. I think it's important to really say how he died. He died. He fell off his horse in the middle of a storm, whilst he was riding to see his wife.
After partying the night before.
Yeah, well, there's some really great poems and stories that have been written on his death as well. And his granddaughter, his only heir, Margaret of Norway, I think she's like 4 years old at this time, and she dies on the boat from Norway to Scotland. During this time as well, though, there was an agreement between Edward I and Scotland that Margaret of Norway will marry his son Edward II, who was also at the same age at the time as well. So you really see this plan between Scotland and England, where there would sort of be a unified Britain in that way of this agreement between a marriage between Margaret of Norway and Edward of Carnarvon. Of course, what's fascinating about this is a great example of the Wheel of Fortune. A Wheel of Fortune that isn't caused by mortal sin, but just pure coincidence. That you have this death of Alexandria III, who's this great king of Scotland, who Edward I it gets along with because he's his brother-in-law, and he dies. And then the Wheel of Fortune again, spins, and Margaret of Norway passes away as well, to the point where things are now just in complete chaos. And the decade, long story short, of course, then the wars of the wars between Scotland and England break out. What's interesting about the letter in 1301, a decade later, that Edward writes to the Pope, is he directly goes back to Geoffrey of Monmouth to justify his wars in Scotland, and to say, I am the rightful overlord of Britain. And during this time, the way that Britain was viewed primarily is a lot of writers viewed England as Britain, and they just viewed the English kings as the rightful overlords. But in this letter anyway, Edward writes, the kings of England, by the right of lordship and dominion, possessed from the most ancient times the success of the realm of Scotland, and they received from self-same kings homage and oaths of fealty. And he goes on to invoke the founding stories of Britain from Monmouth's works by writing, Brutus landed upon a certain island at that time called Albion. He called it after his own name, Britain, and his people Britons. He gave his firstborn, Lucrin, that part of Britain now called England, with royal dignity being reserved for the eldest. And within the letter also, he refers to Edward the Elder, Ethelstan, King Canute as well, and he also refers to King Arthur, who has one of his greatest battles within Scotland as well, near Loch Lomond. So you see him again invoking this tradition of British antiquity, which is directly from Monmouth's works.
And I guess what he's saying there is, with relation to Arthur, is that the Scottish king submits or comes at a certain feast and offers his vassalization to Arthur, right? So it's thus Edward stands not by blood but by lineage in the same, like by virtue of his office, he should also be the overlord of Wales and of Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so this then is contested by the Scots, right? They're not just going to accept this as gospel truth, and so Baldred Bissett, the best named scribe ever, I think, he attempts to respond to Edward's claims in his own letter, and what he does is he argues from a very different tradition, which goes back to Nennius as well, that the Scots were descended not from Brutus, but from Scota or Scotia. And this is a story which claims that Scotia was an Egyptian princess, daughter of the pharaoh involved in the persecution and expulsion of the Israelites under Moses, and that when Moses had, succeeded in being freed from the Egyptians, Scota and her people had to flee as well because they had been favorable to the Israelites. They then made their way to Spain before landing in Ireland. And there's different versions. One is that it's Scota's descendants who reach Scotland. In others, it is Scota herself who arrives in Scotland. Hello, Elizabeth. I'm just sharing the Scottish kind of response to Edward. So Scota becomes the kind of queen mother of Scotland, and her descendants become the kings of Scotland. And she brings with her the stone of Scone, which is connected to the biblical stories. I think in one version, it's the stone which Jacob laid his head on to sleep, and had the vision of this great ladder or stairway to heaven. So and this gets repeated in the Declaration of Arbroath, which is Robert the Bruce puts forward in the 1220s, asserting Scotland's independence, in part because of their ethnic distinctiveness from the English or from the Britons, right? So this becomes the big claim that they put forward to the Pope. They do accept that Arthur may have conquered Scotland at some point, but they suggest actually after that point it reverted straight away, and this makes sense with Geoffrey's narrative, right? Because Arthur's realms fell into chaos after his death. He was unable to maintain it. So you get this sort of narrative emerging initially with Scotland. I'll touch more on the Scottish kind of interpretation of Arthur in a moment, but I wanted to just bring us back to Edward for a second there, because after this kind of exchange of letters with the Pope, who incidentally sides with the Scots, Edward crushes the Scots at the Battle of Falkirk, as you've mentioned, Elizabeth, and hosts a round table in 1304, again kind of reaffirming his kind of unification of Britain in an Arthurian manner, and then takes the stone of Scone and offers it again to Edward the Confessor's shrine. So you're seeing again this pattern repeated, which he did with Wales and now with Scotland.
Yeah, precisely.
So I guess I'll talk a little bit about the Scottish kind of tradition that emerges from this period, because Baldred's attacks on Arthur involve the claim that Arthur was an illegitimate king. And this is quite interesting. I don't think many people will know this kind of line of attack, but essentially it comes from Joffrey's story of Arthur's conception, which is that the wizard Merlin, through dark magics, helped Uther Pendragon essentially impregnate Arthur's mother. And so they were not married at the time, right? So you then get claims that Arthur is the product of both pagan sorcery and adultery.
Got a great picture of that here of
Oh,
Arthur
great.
of Tintagel.
Fantastic. Yeah. So that's the story that's being alluded to here. So they're actually drawing on the history of the kings of Britain, but using it to attack Arthur's legitimacy. By contrast, and this isn't Baldred, but it's later writers like Hector Boece, is it? He was the principal of Aberdeen University, actually.
Oh yeah.
You've got other figures. I think John of Fordun also kind of comments on this. He's a medieval scribe. They say, well, actually, Arthur, his sister is Anna, and she is the child of Uther and Arthur's mother in a legitimate marriage. They had been married at that point, and she is married to King Lothus or Ludinus of Lothian, i.e., Scotland. Now, this character appears in many Arthurian tales and seems to be an ally of Arthur. They say he's not a subject; he's a voluntary ally of Arthur's, and that he has two sons, Mordred and Gawain, and that actually Mordred, by virtue of his descent from Anna and thus of Uther, is a more legitimate claimant to the throne than is Arthur because of his illegitimacy. And in terms of kind of tracing successions, they do have a point. They're of course ignoring the prophecies around Arthur, the drawing of Excalibur from the stone, thus proving he is divinely ordained by God to become king and so on. Although some of these stories aren't fully worked out yet in Geoffrey's tale.
It reflects I think it reflects a Scottish tradition of betraying the English all the time, like with John Barry. Like I think the Scottish love figures which cause chaos and infighting and bring about great kings.
You mean the demise of great kings, right? So
they tried to for the first, but no look. Sadly, he was too great.
A bit of Anglo imperialism going on here. I think.
No, and by Scots, I mean the Lowland Scots. I don't mean the great barbarians in the Highlands, the true Scots. But
wow, I'm just imagining the audience reaction right now. I think though what they're trying to get at, because I don't think they're endorsing like Mordred like causing civil war. I think it's rather Arthur. Some of them concede that Arthur was the right man for the time because Mordred was too young to be king. So maybe that in itself is a comment on Margaret of Norway. But in time, he was the rightful king, and Arthur was overstepping his boundaries, is another claim, that he was a tyrant of sorts. So this is a complete inversion of many, of the main Arthurian kind of tradition. Although there are elements of Arthur not necessarily being a perfect king in some of the romances. But it is very much geared towards defending Scottish independence. Right, so it's not necessarily about trying to debunk King Arthur, or even kind of attack English claims to being like Arthur. It's more we come from a different tradition with a different lineage, with a different line of monarchy, and as such, we have an integrity to defend. And so mythologically, we have to show this, and so they do that through. This kind of King Loth Mordred line, which is quite interesting. It does change with the coming of much later with 1603, with the union of crowns between England and Scotland and James VI, because he then gets in Scotland reinterpreted as the fulfillment of Arthur and uniting Britain. And so suddenly it's a total switch, and Scots are publishing the prophecies of Merlin and saying, look, James has fulfilled them, and so on and so forth. So there is a shift there, but for much of the medieval kind of treatment of Arthur in Scotland, there's definitely an ambivalence, if not outright hostility, to the figure. Did you want to come in, Elizabeth?
Century.
Where did you go? Sorry.
Yeah. And basically on the ceilings of this manor house, which dates back to the 1500s, so even before James, there's this painting on the ceiling of King Arthur, and it was supposed to be. I forgot what it's called. I'll have to get back to you. It's a house. It's like a house in Aberdeenshire, but on the ceiling is King Arthur's painted, and it was in the guest room, and the purpose was, when guests were put next to King John and Julius Caesar, and it was supposed to inspire them to be as great as these kings. And what's great about that is it sort of shows there is this Arthurian sort of tradition later again in Scotland. Another point of Arthur perspective in Scotland is, do you think maybe it could have been linked back to sort of this conflict as well between John Baliol and Robert the Bruce, where John Baliol's this king that actually does have he is the rightful heir to Alexandria III in terms of his family history. And you have the Bruce family who are not so legitimate, trying to say they have a stronger claim. So it could be reflective of that, of John Baliol as this traitor king in the Scottish perspective, and it's Robert the Bruce who leads the Scottish to victory. Well, his son anyway.
I think that's a good point.
Bruces, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and actually, it would again kind of reaffirm the idea that perhaps usurpation of the Mordred kind of usurpation is actually a justified kind of thing to do against Arthur. Well, that would very much help Robert the Bruce taking that sort of line. So yeah, I can see that being part of the story there, and it kind of suggests as well that because I think one of the things that we suffer from in the modern age is we take for granted, like, Thomas Mallory's The Morte d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, which kind of synthesizes everything and take it, okay, that's what the tradition is. But actually, at this time, the stories, even like Joffrey, it's all in flux, right? There's a lot of development to come. There's a lot of new ways of looking at it, disagreements within the tradition. It's not a given how we should see Arthur fully at this point. It's not got that final endpoint that we take as granted. So in a way, like, it's up for grabs. The Scots are. It wouldn't be like if today somebody was trying to make that case, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's more open to different interpretations or different stories coming into the fold. So I think that they're making the most of that, and also trying to. So you've got that on the Arthur side, and then on the Brutus side, it's the Scotus story they're trying to say is actually the true story. So again, reaffirming Bruce's claim by saying he's of that line, he's not of the Brutus line.
Yeah.
It reveals something quite important, I think, about how people thought about politics in the past, because today we think in terms of principles and policies first and foremost. So I'll vote for that guy because he's standing on this manifesto. Or we think of regime change in that way. So like the French Revolution, it's not that we want this person to rule, it's that we want liberty, equality, and fraternity to govern our country. And America's very similar. It's about freedom and the liberty of the individual and so on. So it's very ideological, at least how it's framed, the nature of politics. And who should rule is governed primarily by the values they stand for. Whereas in this time period, people don't appeal to like abstract principles as justifying who should rule. It's by lineage. It's by concrete connections between people who has the right to govern. And this, I think, gets to the heart of how people thought about society at that time. It was it's not a kind of abstract thing with abstract principles that we have to administer. It's that, oh, I have an obligation to this person in particular, and what matters is then who that person is. And that's what people fought over. They didn't fight to change the system, they fought to change who that person should be, who is king, for example. Right? So when we look at these stories, it's a different way of conceiving of how authority works and who has the right to rule, from how we think in many ways.
And a great example of that is the Tudors. With Henry VII, he not only flies the Red Dragon in battle, but it's his son Henry VIII, which directly refers back to the tradition of Brutus and to King Arthur by saying, well, I'm Welsh, I can trace my ancestry to Brutus and Arthur, and Arthur didn't rely on the authority of Rome, therefore I don't either. And he also refers to the fact that Arthur's, he refers to himself as an emperor, and thus if you're an emperor, you rely on the authority of another land to tell you what to do.
That's very true, and I think you're right. And maybe just as we bring this to a close, we'll just say a bit about the Tudors. So Henry VII, he is representing the House of Lancaster in the 1480s, and he goes to war against the House of York, led by Richard III at this point, and marshals his men under the banner of the Red Dragon, which, as we've been alluding to, is prophesied by Merlin in Joffrey's Prophecies of Merlin to overthrow the White Dragon, and thus the Britons overthrowing the English or the Saxons. So he's tapping into that, saying, I am the coming of Arthur. I am going to restore this land once more. And he names his eldest son Arthur. And if he hadn't died, we would have had King Arthur I, which would have been amazing. But it would have been great. And but he died, and his son Henry VIII takes the throne. And as you've just been saying, Elizabeth, he very much taps into Arthur's as a British king who goes to war with Rome. Well, of course, Henry breaks with the Roman Catholic Church and founds the Church of England. He is also the monarch who has this Winchester Edward I round table painted in this design, and you can see the Tudor rose at the middle. So the House of Lancaster, the red, the House of York, the white, the Tudor rose, the bringing of the two together. So the healing of the kingdom, just as Arthur heals Britain and restores Britain, so the Tudors do too. And everything flows out from there. It's almost like the sun's rays coming from the Tudor rose. So with Henry VII and VIII's monarchies, there's this sense of we're restoring Britain to what it once was. The wheel has turned once more. So they too tapped into it. And it's interesting too that just as Joffrey's work was a huge influence on the kind of medieval era, especially when it was first produced, so too was Le Morte d'Arthur of Thomas Malory. That's 1485 that's released. It's the year after Henry's flying the Red Dragon. So you can see again, the literature is having a direct kind of connection, or there's a certain thing going on which everybody suddenly taps into Arthur again, both culturally and in politics.
And that's the great thing about British history, is people are constantly tapping into Arthur all the time. Again, Edward I, the Tudors as well, and of course the Stuarts somewhat too. And I think a great final topic for the stream really is to refer back to modern British politics. I think one of the reasons we see this revival of King Arthur, particularly among our own circles, is because we're tapping into the tradition of who will be our next Arthur, who will unify the Britons, and practice the true virtues of kingship and restore that which Britain has lost. And that's the theme of Arthur we see throughout history. And although Arthur, of course, has a deeper antiquity to Geoffrey of Monmouth, and he's not just this example of great kingship, and there's a debate on whenever he's real or not. I think the best thing that Arthur represents really is true kingship, is a leader which constantly comes again within history in different forms. There's always a second coming of Arthur, and we can see that throughout history, not only with Edward I. There's a debate whenever you could say Oliver Cromwell was really this this second coming of Arthur in the fact he's trying to fix the ruin of Britain and restore it to its principles. And you see that to the point we have to ask ourselves, who will take the sword out of the stone, who will be heroic enough to lead the Britons from ruin into glory. And the reason why I like Geoffrey of Monmouth so much is because there's lessons to be learned from his work, and that's the fact that what will lead to the ruin of Britain and what will lead to everything we love to disappear is our own infighting, and is if we fight among ourselves. If the Britons stay united, then we can restore that which we have lost.
Well, I think that's a beautiful and perfect way to bring this discussion to a close. I couldn't add anything more to that. So let me just say thank you, Elizabeth. I have thoroughly enjoyed talking about Arthur and Geoffrey and Edward, and just getting to grips with how much influence Arthur's legend has had on British politics, and not just in the past, but tantalizing for our own day as well. Is there anything you would like to promote or advertise about yourself before we finish?
You can follow me on Twitter, Elizabeth_Eno2. I also have a YouTube channel called Eno2. But if you're interested in more about Edward I and his connection to King Arthur and his British vision, I've written an article on it, about it on Substack. So check that out as well.
Everyone should check that out. It's really good.
Yeah, the link's on yeah.
And we all hope that we'll see more of you and Edward I in the future. That's what we all want, really. You've got to do it. You've got to do more. Got to get more out there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for watching. Stay tuned. No doubt there'll be something following this as part of King Arthur Day. So keep going. You're probably halfway through. Well done. The marathon's still got another half to go. So keep going. Till we next meet again. God bless you all. Goodbye.